Welcome to the Martin Luther King Jr. Day lecture after Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It's not that we're just perennial late here at the University of Montana, but we try to arrange this at a time where our students can benefit from it. I'm Tobin Miller-Scheer. I'm an assistant professor in the history department and the coordinator of the African American Studies program. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. I'd like to begin by offering a number of points of gratitude for making this lecture possible. First, to the Office of the President, who provided funding, as well as the Excellence Fund. The Departments of History and African American Studies provided logistical support, and need to give a particular shout out to Mike Mayer for his leadership as the chair of the Martin Luther King Jr. Day Committee and for organizing this event and many events in the past. Our speaker tonight, Glenn Eskew, comes to us from Georgia State University in Atlanta. And there's a lot of things that we could say about him. We could talk, for example, about his book, But for Birmingham, the local and national civil movements in the civil rights struggle. We could talk about the awards it has received from the Southern Historical Society and Longwood College. We could talk about his writings since that book came out on Birmingham and his more recent work on the Southern songster Johnny Mercer. We could talk about his skill as a pedagogue. We could talk about the fact, if we wanted to, that he was a roommate of Professor John Eglin once in the ancient past. But none of that would do justice to what he will do tonight. As I've had the pleasure of talking with Professor Eskew and becoming familiar with his work, he does a very important task, not only in terms of our understanding of historiography, the professional study of history, but also in terms of our popular understanding of the civil rights movement. As is the case with several well-known points in history, the civil rights movement has, to a degree in the popular imagination, become passé. We know the images of the snarling dogs that Bull Connor released on the Birmingham demonstrators. We know the images of the fire hoses and the water streaming forth and buffeting children against cement walls. But behind that stark moral contrast of the really good people and the really bad people is a complex story. One that challenges our understandings about the way history has unfolded in the past, that pulls apart the many strands of who were opposed and who were against and who were in the middle and how those against and for and middle came about, and indeed asks us to re-examine what we think we know about the civil rights movement. So, in anticipation of his lecture, Connor, King, Kennedy, Birmingham icons tell the civil rights story. Please join me in welcoming Professor Glenn Eskew to the University of Montana.
Thank you, Tobin, and I'm glad you didn't talk about me. And good evening. I bring you greetings from Atlanta, where 4 inches of snow can bring an international city to a standstill and close the schools for 5 days. Atlanta's home to CNN, and you might have watched with amazement the newscast showing Georgians trying to deal with what they call snow apocalypse. Of course, Atlanta is also home of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose legacy we are celebrating tonight. And I would like to thank you all for coming out to hear my talk, to thank President Royce Angstrom, Department of History Chair and former roommate, Dr. John Eglin, Professor Mike Mayer, and your wonderful colleagues in the department and graduate students whom I've had a pleasure getting to meet and talk with throughout the day, and this invitation for me to get to come be with you tonight. The climax of the civil rights struggle occurred in Birmingham in 1963. President John F. Kennedy attributed his decision to propose watershed civil rights legislation to Commissioner T. Eugene Bull Connor's use of police dogs and fire hoses against the protesting black school children led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King's national group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, came to Birmingham to assist the local Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, led by the Reverend Fred L. Shuttlesworth. The resulting Birmingham campaign provoked a brutal response that not only created a crisis in local race relations, but also forced a reluctant President Kennedy to propose a resolution to the national race problem. In the iconography of civil rights history, 3 images stand above the rest: the Birmingham triptych of Connor, King, and Kennedy. Behind the hoses and the dogs stood Bull Connor. As city commissioner, Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor enforced Birmingham's segregation ordinances, a job he relished. Connor first gained notoriety during the Great Depression, when, as the city's young commissioner of public safety, he interrupted a group of black and white New Dealers meeting in 1938 as the Southern Conference for Human Welfare, and forced this biracial Southern liberals to segregate. At the apparent behest of the Big Mules, the local name given to the city's industrial elite who profited from the race wage, Connor split the audience, gathered in a municipal auditorium, into white and colored sections so that the divisive issue of race would scuttle their joint efforts at reform. Hamstrung, the black and white liberals capitulated to the law, while the special guest of the evening, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, pulled her chair into the middle of the aisle to bridge the racial divide. 10 years later, in July of 1948, when the delegates to the Democratic National Convention adopted a civil rights plank to the party platform, Bull Connor grabbed the state standard and marched most of the Alabama delegation out of the Philadelphia Convention Hall. Back in Birmingham, in the same municipal auditorium where the biracial Southern liberals had gathered a decade before, Bull Connor welcomed to Alabama the white supremacist states' rights faction of the Democrat Party. The journalists quickly dubbed them the Dixiecrats. Again, these Southern elites used race to stymie reform, as Bull Connor cultivated a reputation as a racial extremist, a tough persona for a tough town. Birmingham existed because of the close proximity of coal, iron ore, and limestone, ingredients necessary for the making of steel. Heavy industry dominated the city's political economy as absentee-owned corporations exploited the region's cheap labor costs. With desperate cotton farmers fleeing the poverty of the countryside for the opportunities of the city, industrialists could rely on a ready supply of black and white workers waiting for jobs outside the factory gates. Birmingham's largest employer, the Tennessee Coal and Railroad Company, known as TCI, was a subsidiary of the monopolistic United States Steel Corporation. While Pittsburgh determined TCI's policy, creative uses of interlocking directorates and sizable contracts with would-be competitors enabled TCI to determine Big Mule policy, as a consensus in Birmingham developed among the bank, railroad, and insurance executives, and by extension, the city's middle-level managers, politicians, ministers, and civic leaders behind the interests of the industrialists. That included a defense of a race wage, lower pay for black workers as a method of keeping white wages low too. By enforcing segregation, which artificially divided black and white public space and thereby reinforced racial divisions in the workplace, industrialists justified a bifurcated race wage that paid black workers less than white ones, but both about half of the national average for the same job. By maintaining segregation, Bull Connor kept the city running in the interests of the Big Mules. In June of 1956, a new black protest group set out to alter race relations in Birmingham. Led by the Reverend Fred L. Shuttlesworth, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, or ACMHR, used direct action to challenge the legality of the city's segregation ordinances. Shuttlesworth had formed the new protest group in response to the state of Alabama's successful attack against the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in the wake of its support for Miss Autherine Lucy's attempt to desegregate the University of Alabama. When the state required the NAACP to reveal its membership lists, the organization shut down its local chapters rather than expose its members to harassment. So Shuttlesworth formed the Alabama Christian Movement to agitate for race reform. His organization attracted a small but loyal group of deeply religious activists who firmly believed God would help them end segregation, while their fanaticism enabled them to face down the violence of night bombings and mob attacks by white vigilantes. It also limited their appeal to other like-minded working-class Christians, as only 10% of Birmingham's black churches actively supported the civil rights movement. Few members of the black middle class or of the underclass supported the ACMHR. Instead, the group's members had more in common with rank-and-file religious activists in other communities who joined through their churches the growing civil rights movement. Across the South, there emerged new black leaders, preachers, who believed that as Christians, they were obligated to confront the sin of segregation. Most well known was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who gained national attention with the Montgomery bus boycott. This struggle to integrate the city buses concluded in December 1956, when the United States Supreme Court, echoing its previous Brown decision against school segregation, by ordering an end to segregated seating on municipal transportation. Shuttlesworth sought implementation of the ruling on Birmingham's buses. Following the school desegregation crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights attempted to register black students at all-white Phillips High School in 1957. It integrated Birmingham's terminal train station in 1958, the airport in 1959, and tried to access whites-only city parks in 1960. Shuttlesworth bravely led Birmingham's civil rights struggle. Bull Connor determined to thwart the desegregation drive. He arrested Shuttlesworth and other integrationists, dodged court orders to stop segregating the buses, and rather than integrate the parks as ordered by the courts, he chose to close them. A duplicitous Connor enabled vigilante violence against the civil rights activists. When Shuttlesworth vowed to ride desegregated buses in 1956, white night riders dynamited Bethel Baptist Church and parsonage, nearly killing the civil rights activist. He crawled out of the rubble and became a symbol of divine intervention as one follower cried out, "God save the Reverend," to lead the movement. Twice more, vigilantes bombed Bethel Baptist, among other venues of civil rights activity. A mob attacked Shuttlesworth when he tried to register his black children at the White High School, and again targeted civil rights activists during the desegregation of the train station. When the Freedom Riders reached Alabama in May of 1961, Ku Klux Klansmen firebombed one bus outside Anniston, and in Birmingham, Connor allowed a white mob of Klansmen to beat the nonviolent activists with impunity. Criticized for not providing police protection, a disingenuous commissioner of public safety explained the force was off for Mother's Day. Into the breach stepped Shuttlesworth as the Alabama Christian Movement members rescued the stranded black and white activists. The national condemnation of Birmingham following the Freedom Rides convinced several white businessmen linked to an emerging service economy to turn against Connor as fractures appeared in the Big Mule consensus. These lawyers and realtors hatched a plan to remove the Commissioner of Public Safety from office by changing the city's form of government. Voters selected the mayor-council system in November 1962, with new elections for officers slated for spring 1963. Connor vowed to hold on to power by running for the new post of mayor. Frustrated by the slow process of change, Shuttlesworth invited King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to Birmingham. As an umbrella organization, the SCLC had provided assistance to local affiliates, such as the Alabama Christian Movement, and indeed, Shuttlesworth himself had helped co-found the SCLC and served as its secretary since its inception in 1957. Agreeing to work together, the two groups planned an attack on segregation as the ACMHR-SCLC in what they called the Johannesburg of the South, their euphemism for Birmingham, which conflated race relations in the city with the hateful apartheid regime in South Africa. King had just been badly burned in Albany, Georgia, where a year of disorganized civil rights protests had done little to alter race relations, despite hundreds of arrests that nearly bankrupted the protest groups with bail bonds and court costs. Consequently, King approached Birmingham with caution. He determined the joint ACMHR-SCLC effort in Birmingham would not follow the same strategy of trying to fill the jail as had been the case in Albany. Instead, they developed a strategy of limited sit-ins that focused on a boycott of the city's merchants, figuring the retail segment of Birmingham's business community could pressure City Hall into relenting on segregation. Hoping to remove Connor from office, the civil rights leaders postponed their planned sit-ins until after the April 2, 1963 runoff election. Although Bull Connor lost his bid for mayor that day, he refused to leave office, instead contesting the legality of the whole change in city government. The resulting lawsuits kept the city commission in power, although the new mayor and council organized as a shadow government that anticipated a judge's ruling in favor of its legitimacy. Unwilling to await the outcome of Connor's court challenge, the movement initiated its boycott of downtown businesses with a sit-in at lunch counters that refused to serve food to black patrons. While the Birmingham News touted the change in government and the election of the segregationist big mule Albert Boutwell over Bull Connor as mayor, starting a new day in Birmingham's history, the real dawn occurred when 20 black men and women, dressed in their Sunday best, quietly asked for coffee at Britland's and Woolworth cafeterias. These black adults, led by Shuttlesworth's lieutenants, the Reverends Abraham and Calvin Woods, who are pictured here, and others, drew on their deep faith that God would protect them in their struggle for race reform. Connor's men arrested the protesters. At a mass meeting that night, Shuttlesworth and King announced other demonstrations would follow that spring 1963 as Birmingham confronted a civil rights campaign amidst the chaos of two competing municipal governments. The first civil rights protest march occurred on April 6th when Shuttlesworth led demonstrators to City Hall to ask that a previously denied parade permit be issued. The local activist deviated from the tightly organized ACMHR-SCLC script that focused on sit-ins in support of a selective buying campaign. He did so in order to generate community interest in the protest movement. Police stopped the procession and arrested the 43 activists. The next day, Martin Luther King's brother, the Reverend A.D. King, who pastored a nearby church, headed a column of 24 out of the church and into streets lined with nearly 1,000 African American onlookers. While not members of the nonviolent Alabama Christian movement, these black bystanders, many of them unskilled and unemployed workers of the black underclass, identified with the desire for race reform. The arrest of the marchers after walking only 2 blocks provoked civic unrest. When the Canine Corps arrived to break up the gallery, one black youth poked a lead pipe at a police dog. The German Shepherd attacked, pinning the young man to the ground. Immediately, officers moved in, swinging billy clubs and sicking the dogs. Policemen dispersed the crowd. While reporting brutality, the national press mistook the bystanders as members of the movement, thus sensationalizing the number of protesters and exaggerating the support the movement received within the black community. Recognizing the power of such creative tension brought on by this provocation, King capitalized on the error by staging future episodes after black bystanders had gathered and ending them by 2 p.m. so that national film crews might get their footage on a plane to New York City for the night's evening news. Increasingly, Birmingham became a media event. Despite the use of dogs, Connor tried to follow the example of Police Chief Laurie Pritchett, who defeated the SCLC's drive in Albany, Georgia, by meeting King's nonviolence with nonviolence. Connor obtained a state court circuit order restraining King, Shuttlesworth, and others from leading protest marches. King's decision to obey a similar injunction in Georgia the year before had virtually ended the Albany campaign. Indeed, the lack of interest shown by the national media over the Birmingham campaign and the limited support the effort received within the local black community threatened another outcome like Albany, where many people had questioned King's leadership capabilities. With the ACMHR and SCLC coffers nearly empty and the Birmingham campaign yet to ignite, King decided to defy the state court order and lead the protest march. He reasoned that all men had an obligation to violate unjust laws. Therefore, he willingly subjected himself to the dangers of arrest. Lieutenant Andrew Young saw the decision as the defining moment in the civil rights leader's life, for King had crossed his own Rubicon. The ACMHR SCLC hoped King's arrest would attract more local support for their campaign, generate more donations for bail bonds, and trigger federal support for desegregation. Dressed in the blue denim of the working man, King marched 50 people past 1,000 black onlookers on April 12th. Law enforcement officials stepped in and ushered the integrationists into waiting paddy wagons. The arrest of King focused attention on Birmingham, as well as the Oval Office. President John F. Kennedy claimed via federalism that he had no legal authority to intervene in the dispute, so he remained non-committal, although he did arrange a telephone call between the integrationist and his wife, Coretta Scott King. While held incommunicado, King began his letter from Birmingham jail in response to critical comments by a local clergyman. These white moderates had previously criticized the hostile rhetoric of Alabama's new governor, George C. Wallace, whose segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever inaugural speech had echoed the motto of the Ku Klux Klan and served as a rallying cry of resistance to race reform. Now these 8 leaders of the state's Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish congregations condemned the civil rights demonstrations as unwise and untimely. Perhaps his greatest written work, King's letter from Birmingham jail, presented the case for nonviolent direct action and the theological terms of the social gospel. He echoed the New Testament letters of St. Paul by stressing the need for all Christians to answer calls for aid by people struggling against injustice. Laid out like a legal brief, King's argument for civil disobedience explained the principles of nonviolence, just as he echoed the jurist who said, "Justice too long delayed is justice denied." King's heartfelt prose gave testament to the urgency of the civil rights struggle. The Friends Society arranged a printing of the letter that received wide distribution following the Birmingham campaign. While national interest grew during King's 8-day incarceration, local support waned. The Alabama Christian movement had provided most of the foot soldiers so far, those fanatical Christians whose faith enabled them to overcome the vigilante violence and stand up to Bull Connor's policemen when others simply watched from the sidelines. Yet the past 3 weeks had taxed their resources as their numbers dwindled with each arrest. Once out on bond, King struggled to find new volunteers for his nonviolent army. The Birmingham campaign teetered on the brink of collapse as only a few dedicated activists demonstrated. Yet since the beginning of the mass meetings, as adults met in the sanctuaries upstairs, young people had gathered in the fellowship halls downstairs for special youth activities led by Dorothy Cotton of SCLC that consisted of citizenship classes and workshops in nonviolence. King's lieutenants, James Bevel and Ike Reynolds, suggested the young people should march. Opposition from Birmingham's traditional Negro leadership class, which had never supported the movement and had consistently undercut local black support for the campaign, failed to sway King, who acquiesced to the idea out of desperation to create creative tension and keep the national press focused on events in Birmingham. The Children's Crusade began at noon on May 2nd with what movement strategists called D-Day, as hundreds of black students, those youth connected to the mass meetings and their friends, as they skipped school, gathered at movement centers such as 16th Street Baptist Church, which is pictured here, then embarked on a protest march. Wave after wave of black boys and girls washed down the tile steps into Kelly Ingram Park, headed toward downtown. The youngsters took Connor by surprise, but by the end of the day, police had arrested 500 black teenagers and cramped them into jail cells. Hearing that the young people had joined the Birmingham campaign, Malcolm X expressed his disapproval, announcing at a press conference, quote, "Real men don't put their children on the firing line." The next morning, King promised bigger marches unless the merchants desegregated. Bull had other ideas. To prevent demonstrations, Connor stationed firemen around the park, sealed off the black business district from downtown. Attack dogs strained on their leashes, intimidating many in the black audience of onlookers, while other bystanders taunted the officers. When the black youth exited the church, Connor hollered, "Let 'em have it," as water gushed out of fire hoses, blasting blindly at males and females, spinning students down the sidewalks with pressure high enough to tear the bark off trees. "I want to see the dogs work," barked Bull, exclaiming, "Look at those niggers run." Loosened, the dogs lunged at the black crowd, ripping at clothes in search of flesh. Police arrested 700 people, emptying the area. Half an hour later, the horrifying spectacle had ended, but it was captured forever on film. Through his actions, Connor achieved immortality. His barbarous treatment of young, peaceful protesters, the hoses and the dogs, elevated Bull's Birmingham into a national symbol of racial oppression. At least 250 journalists reported the event that dominated the front pages of newspapers around the world, suggesting the hypocrisy of American democracy. Footage of the brutal suppression played on the broadcast of all three networks. Now, one must pause and imagine, or for some of us perhaps recall, television in 1963. Most houses had a black and white set that could pick up the three stations as local affiliates of the national networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS. There was no cable news network or Fox News broadcasting round-the-clock reports. And the anchormen of the three networks were highly respected as unbiased journalists presenting the truth. People watched the still novel evening news that broadcast for only a half hour, with 15 minutes of national and international stories packaged by the studios in New York, and 15 minutes set aside for local reports inserted by the affiliates. The Birmingham film clips filled up the entire 30-minute broadcast of the television evening news. The racial crisis played out in Alabama and dominated the front pages of national and international newspapers. The pictures on television and in the papers sickened President Kennedy. who decided to act. He ordered his assistant, Burt Marshall, who worked as an assistant attorney general for civil rights, to Birmingham to end the protests. Unrestrained, Bull Connor routed another demonstration that Saturday afternoon, this time using the fire hoses to keep the protesters pinned in the church. Rather than hold marches on Sunday, black civil rights activists tried to worship at the leading white churches downtown, gaining entrance to some and thereby joining in the services, while being banned from others and holding kneel-ins outside on the sidewalks. When the school children resumed protest marches Monday, May 6th, however, Connor refrained from using force. Instead of the infamous hoses and dogs, his officers arrested youthful offenders and loaded them onto school buses that rumbled off to prison. As the momentum increased, classrooms emptied into the streets, as young people with no prior connection to the movement now joined into the struggle. With dignity, students marched in picket lines, carrying signs that called for equal rights. Children ran into the arms of policemen, prompting Bull Connor to remark, "Boy, if that's religion, I don't want any." By day's end, officers had arrested more than 1,000 black youth. The city turned the stockade at the state fairgrounds into a holding pen, for the movement had accomplished what it failed to do in Albany. It had filled the jail to capacity. The next morning, with Double D-Day, movement strategists exploited police lunch breaks by beginning their marches earlier in a bid to upset social order through a large nonviolent demonstration designed to shut the city down. Activists reported false alarms to divert the fire department. Small groups of protesters acted as decoys to distract police, while hundreds of other black students followed different routes around Bull's blockade. For weeks, Connor had kept the demonstrations confined to the black business district, but the foot soldiers in the nonviolent army outmaneuvered his officers. Singing freedom songs, black folks swarmed down the streets and sidewalks through the heart of Birmingham. A sea of dark faces produced wave upon wave of jubilant integrationists whose light-spirited singing of the Birmingham hit 99 and a half Won't Do drowned out the chimes playing Dixie from the Protective Life building. At noon, the protesters converged in the city's white business district along First Avenue North. Picket signs appeared in front of the major department stores down 19th Street. Hundreds of black citizens milled about the offices on 20th Street as some knelt in prayer. "We're marching for freedom," cheered one, as thousands of others filled the surrounding streets, bringing the traffic to a standstill. For white people, it appeared that Armageddon had arrived. The black masses knew it as Jubilee Day. The fear had gone. Shouts of joy blended with once sinister sirens as protesters passed policemen unmolested. In Birmingham, civil order had collapsed. A group of big mules discussing the demonstrations broke for lunch only to emerge from the Chamber of Commerce into the chaos below. These businessmen recognized the loss of social control and understood the danger it posed to the city. They hastily reconvened and determined to negotiate an end to the crisis. Although President Kennedy's envoy, Burt Marshall, saw his role as that of a moderator between two opposing interests, his very presence in Birmingham signaled a potential shift in federal policy. While unclear how far Kennedy might go, he obviously recognized the call for race reform. Incensed that the movement's maneuvering had outfoxed him, Connor reverted to violence. High-powered hoses repulsed school children as they exited the 16th Street Baptist Church. A pitched battle broke out between the firemen blasting away blindly with the water and the nonviolent protesters in Kelly Ingram Park. Bystanders threatened to riot, throwing rocks and bricks at officers. As black violence began to undermine the moral high ground of the movement, civil rights activists stepped in to quell the disorder by calling the protests off for the day. Then Bull Connor saw local movement leader Fred Shuttlesworth, and he ordered his firemen to train their hoses on him. The water lifted the black minister off the ground and slammed him into the side of the church. Learning that an ambulance had taken his old nonviolent adversary to the hospital, Connor sneered, "I wish they'd carried him away in a hearse." After arriving in Birmingham, Marshall quickly convinced King to stop the demonstrations. With whites willing to negotiate, Kennedy's envoy acted as a go-between, hammering out an ambiguous agreement that considered the movement's demands for desegregation, biracial communication, and equal employment. With Shuttlesworth incapacitated by his injuries, the ACMHR-SCLC partnership dissolved as King and his lieutenants manipulated the negotiations to suit the needs of the national movement. Speaking for the local movement, a frustrated Shuttlesworth insisted on the threat of continued demonstrations until all the demands were met. But then he joined the civil rights activists to announce the end to the protest during a press conference held in the courtyard of the A.G. Gaston Motel. That night, the Ku Klux Klan bombed King's room in Gaston's motel and the house of his brother, the Reverend A.D. King, in an effort to assassinate the civil rights leader. The vigilante violence spawned a black riot that ignited Birmingham's ghetto, a harbinger of the long, hot summers yet to come in Watts, Detroit, Washington. But in Birmingham, the truce held. The city embarked on an uneasy future. Only willing to negotiate when the white violence reflected badly on his administration, President Kennedy intervened to the uprising of Birmingham's black underclass. He mobilized the armed forces. He stationed riot control units at nearby military bases and threatened martial law in the city. His televised statement of May 8, 1963, emphasized the need to restore order. Defending his policy of federalism that limited the involvement of the federal government, Kennedy urged Birmingham's citizens to accept the negotiated accord and make outside military intervention unnecessary. Yet civil disorders had spread beyond Birmingham. In the weeks that followed, some 750 demonstrations occurred in more than 185 cities across the United States, with nearly 15,000 arrests of protesters. Civil rights organizations sponsored sympathy marches in Philadelphia, St. Paul, Los Angeles. About 5,000 people took to the streets in Boston over the brutality of Birmingham. Suddenly, a national civil rights rebellion was at hand. To the nation's white elite, it appeared that black America could follow one of two routes: the nonviolent movement for assimilation into the American system, led by Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, or what it feared was the apparently violent alternative of black separatism advocated by Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. In light of Connor's savagery and the outrage of many African Americans, the nation's media, from the television stations and newspapers to the news magazines, began to rewrite the history of the Birmingham campaign. Previously, the media had presented Dr. King as an outside agitator, exacerbating a local race problem. But after the Birmingham campaign, Time and Newsweek and other media outlets heralded a moderate King and his gospel of nonviolence. Forced to accept the civil rights revolution, the Northeastern establishment circled around a charismatic King who preached love and abhorred violence. The same circumstances that transformed King's image altered Kennedy's persona as well. For following Birmingham, the president proposed federal reforms to end America's discriminatory race practices. Not only Bull Connor, but George Wallace had caused Kennedy grief as the feisty governor's stand in the schoolhouse door of the University of Alabama had come off looking like a victory for resistance to federal authority, despite the Kennedy administration's successful implementation of the desegregation ruling. During a national broadcast on June 11, 1963, the president admitted that Birmingham posed problems he could no longer, quote, prudently ignore. To stop the demonstrations, the destruction of property, the negative publicity, Kennedy called for sweeping legislation, for he believed new moral laws would successfully shift the protests from the streets into the courts. 8 days later, he sent to Congress his revolutionary Civil Rights Bill of 1963, which hearkened back to Reconstruction by setting forth legal reforms designed to achieve implementation of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution and the aborted Civil Rights Act of 1875. To outlaw racial discrimination, the federal government would enforce compliance with the new laws by regulating interstate commerce and withholding federal funds. Yet Southern segregationists in Congress stalled the legislation. Building on the success of Birmingham, civil rights leaders planned a protest march on Washington. Summoning the activists to the White House, President Kennedy expressed his opposition to the idea, fearing the move might jeopardize his new legislative agenda. King responded that the march was no more ill-timed than the Birmingham campaign. As the topic shifted to police brutality, the president said, "I don't think you should all be totally harsh on Bull Connor." In the startled silence that followed, Kennedy quipped, "After all, he's done more for civil rights than almost anybody else." Shuttlesworth remembered the president saying something different. But for Birmingham, we would not be here today. To be fair, had Shuttlesworth and the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights not demanded the changes, there would have been no violence from Bull Connor to force the issue of race reform on a reluctant president and America. Yet popular perception quickly shifted this once central figure of the civil rights struggle to the sidelines as Shuttlesworth fell into obscurity following the spring 1963 demonstrations. Indeed, Birmingham provided the climax of the civil rights movement, and the March on Washington simply celebrated that fact. Instead of the massive protests at the Capitol as originally envisaged by A. Philip Randolph, the event became an affirmation of the American dream. No one sounded the theme better than Martin Luther King, who gave the address of his life before an integrated audience of at least 250,000 people, with millions more watching by television. With rolling cadences, his I Have a Dream speech epitomized African American desires for assimilation. Nearly tailor-made to fit the demands of Kennedy's legislation before Congress, the oration reasoned the need for race reform, like his letter from Birmingham jail, while concluding with a resounding expression of faith in the American system. Remembering that August day in 1963, Coretta Scott King recalled the sanctification of King as he stood in the sunlight at the summit of the Lincoln Memorial. Quote, "At that moment," she said, "it seemed as if the kingdom of God appeared." Thereafter, the media constructed an icon of the civil rights leader, a symbol of triumphant nonviolence, marching in Birmingham and espousing the American dream in Washington. In short order, King won Time magazine's Man of the Year and then the Nobel Peace Prize. Overwhelmed by his transfiguration, King accepted his newfound glory with wonder. Likewise, Kennedy underwent a transformation. Whatever promise his administration had died in Dallas along with the idealistic president in November of 1963. A shocked nation watched with numbness the widow and the young heirs of America's royal family as the nation buried its fallen hero. In a touching interview shortly after Kennedy's assassination, former First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy likened the heady excitement of her husband's administration to the mythical Camelot of Broadway musical fame. Soon the media set to work, recasting the image of the late president into that of the ennobled race reformer. In reality, a less than aggressive president seeking re-election and afraid of losing the votes of white Southerners had allowed segregationists in Congress to stymie his Civil Rights Bill of '63. Now the unexpected president, Lyndon B. Johnson, encouraged passage of Kennedy's race reform package as a tribute to the martyred leader. Having spent his career on Capitol Hill, the tough Texan knew how to deliver legislation by calling in the chits and cutting the deals. Johnson faced down the filibuster of Southern senators, and he pushed the legislation through both houses. The adoption by Congress of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 marked a watershed in national race relations. The act outlined equal employment opportunities that opened the American system not just to African Americans, but to all ethnicities and other minorities, including women, gays and lesbians, and the handicapped. Thus this triptych, the juxtaposed icons of Connor, King, and Kennedy, symbolize the struggle to overthrow racial oppression in the South. Taken together, the three images tell the modern story of race reform in America. First, there is Bull Connor, the fat, beady-eyed little man, waving on with his pork pie hat, the hoses and the dogs against helpless black youth. Then there is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., having overcome the hoses and the dogs, but now frozen in time at the Lincoln Memorial, celebrating the Birmingham victory with his I Have a Dream speech. Finally, there's President John F. Kennedy in the haze of the White House Camelot, benevolently intervening to fulfill the American creed of equality. These images live forever as stock photographs and film footage that gets incorporated into Eyes on the Prize and other popular documentaries that are replayed every January on King Day and during February's Black History Month, when the nation recalls the African American freedom struggle. As icons, the images retell over and again a morality play of triumphant race reform, clearly centering the climax of the civil rights movement in the streets of Birmingham. Thank you.
Professor Eskew has left us lots of time for questions, so we invite you to raise your hand, and I'll let you call upon those
Sure.
that you want to engage with. Please.
Have any of you ever been to Birmingham? Just drove through? Yeah. I encourage you to go. Several of you have been. There's now a Birmingham Civil Rights Institute that opened in 1992 that memorializes this history. And if you get to Birmingham, I encourage you to make efforts to go there. You can also tour the 16th Street Baptist Church, which is, of course, the site of the bombing in September of 1963 that claimed the lives of 4 girls during the heightened tensions over school desegregation. And it's open for tours as well. So they're great sites you can go see. Birmingham has really gone to great lengths to embrace and interpret this history. So it's a great thing to get to go do. Yes, sir.
Speaking of churches, I was interested in the fact that you said 10% of black churches supported the civil rights movement. I'm surprised that was so low. Could you expand on why that may have been?
Absolutely, yeah, sure. The number comes from Andrew Young, who gave the estimation. And what Young was pointing to were churches that had been part of Shuttlesworth's movement. And they affiliated with the Alabama Christian movement. So they were, in effect, movement churches. And the way the movement organized after it formed in 1956, they would hold weekly mass meetings. The mass meetings were held on Monday nights. And the structure of the meeting was very much like a church service. But rather than being a religious service, even though it's held in a church and it's led by ministers, the thrust was over civil reforms, civil issues like voting rights and equal accommodations. And yet the format was very similar to a church service. It would open with music, but the music wasn't hymns. The music would be freedom songs. And so rather than the song being about salvation and going to heaven, I Shall Overcome, which was a spiritual song, is turned into We Shall Overcome, which is a protest song. And so the whole thrust was to take what was very familiar within the black community, a religious experience, and mobilize it for social reform. And the meetings moved from church to church. They wouldn't be held at the same church every week. Shuttlesworth Church, Bethel Baptist, would host a meeting, but then other pastors who were leaders in the movement would likewise hold the meeting. And what that allowed was for the cost to be spread out among the various congregations. And the whole financing of the movement, as in church, in the black tradition, when you would make a donation to the church, it wasn't uncommon for the members of the congregation to stand up and go pew by pew down to the altar, holding the money they were donating up in the air. Everyone could see what they were giving, and putting it in the plate. Similarly, at civil rights mass meetings, the fundraising was the same thing. They would have an offertory moment, and you would hold your money up and put it in the plate. But by spreading it among the different churches, you're spreading that cost, but you're also spreading the risk. The movements in Birmingham was rooted in a fanatical kind of Christianity, and that was because of the violence. It took some kind of strength to be able to stand up to the intimidation, not just of the police department, but also of vigilantes who struck at night with dynamite bombings of houses and churches. And the reason the number was so few was because of the danger. A lot of pastors did not want to put their churches at risk. A lot of pastors understood external pressures. And the more prominent churches, the middle-class churches, those pastors were often linked to white churches, and they were unwilling to go against the social norm. In fact, while 16th Street is the iconic church in Birmingham of the civil rights movement, it was not a movement church. Its congregation had never affiliated with the Alabama Christian movement, and most of its members did not support Shuttlesworth's campaign. But it had always been the community church. It was the largest, it was one of the largest black churches in the city. It was located in the heart of the black business district, and it was finally King, because of his affiliation with the pastor there, prevailed upon the church congregation to open it up and allow mass meetings to take place there. And so the bombing that occurs that kills four of the parishioners, there's a great irony to all of that. Yeah. Yes?
I pose several ideas. First, having been to Birmingham, I have no idea exactly what went on. Or my question is how many white people were involved in the help of the civil rights within the South, if there was any? And then my second kind of idea is 40-some years later now today, how is life in Birmingham as far as, like, are there churches that integrate freely with white and black congregations together, or is it still kind of they separate?
Both very good questions. I'll start with the first one. There were a handful of white people, native Southerners, who got involved in the civil rights movement over the span of the 50s and 60s. Their number was few, but they're important people who participated. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC it's called, which organized following the student sit-ins in 1960, was integrated from the beginning. And among the founding members was a white woman from Decatur, Georgia, Connie Curry, and a white man from South Alabama named Bob Zellner. And they were early founding members of SNCC, and there were a lot of others who joined in, Joan, and there was just a variety of others who joined in. But with the SCLC, it was pretty much black pastors who were leading overwhelmingly African American movements in southern cities like Birmingham or Albany or Selma in those communities. There was a sprinkling of white students who would engage, even protest, as like the campaign in Birmingham. There was a Methodist seminarian, a white seminarian named James Rivers, who participates in some of the demonstrations. And when his superiors find out about this, he's finishing up his degree in seminary. He's looking for a church to pastor. They send him as a missionary to Africa, thinking that's if he's interested in civil rights, then that's what we'll do with him. There was some white female students at a local Methodist church who attended some of the mass meetings. But overwhelmingly, it was African Americans who were leading this protest movement during the civil rights struggle. Now, to answer the question today, you have a variety of approaches of integration or desegregation and efforts at interracial Christian fellowship. On the one hand, you have congregations that are just racially mixed. 16th Street has some white members, as well as there's a core of old black members who've been there for generations, and the new African Americans who have joined, and Caribbeans actually, others, internationals who moved to Birmingham and live in that area who attend that church. You also find, though, that there's a lot of effort and Pentecostal churches tend to be the most integrated, and the large mega churches tend to be very integrated in the South today. But you also find a great deal of effort. The Methodist Church, perhaps making up for that rude treatment of the seminarian back in the 50s, has really reached out to try to bring African Americans into the larger white churches in the suburban regions and to encourage interracial activities among congregations, as have the Southern Baptists, believe it or not, with fellowship meetings where, say, the congregation at 16th Street will meet with a suburban Baptist church, and the two congregations will get together for joint worship services. But generally speaking, on Sundays, they're still segregated in their communities. And the truth is really that church is a reflection of society, and society is being segregated by class and race. The churches tend to maintain that segregation too. So in some ways, King's comment that Sunday, the church hour on Sunday remains the most segregated in America in some ways persists. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Shuttlesworth, after 1963, did he stay involved in the movement in any particular way?
He absolutely did. He continued to be involved, but he's still the leader of the movement in Birmingham and will remain so for years. Even though he will have moved to Cincinnati because he found he was called by a larger parish that could pay more money. He had kids going into college. There were a variety of factors. The problem with Shuttlesworth was after the nation interpreted Birmingham as a success, how do you then turn around and demand for continued protest because things haven't changed, right? How do you turn around and then admit that your success wasn't really quite the success that everyone thinks it is? That on the one hand was part of his problem. The other half was that he challenged King. And when King stepped in after Shuttlesworth was off in the hospital, and King called off the demonstrations, and the plan was for King and one of Kennedy's assistants to give a joint press release announcing that the demonstrations were over, everything was being worked out in Birmingham. When Shuttlesworth heard that there was about to be a press conference for this to take place without him, he left the hospital IV bottle in his pocket, still in pajamas, went to where King was and challenged him. And basically told him down and said, "You're not doing that. And if I have to go out and die in the street, I will lead a protest march to continue these demonstrations." King's lieutenants never forgave him. They just, you didn't challenge King like that. And consequently, they pushed him out of the circle. And for the longest time, he was in obscurity.
When the press, late in the summer of '63,
Right.
when the national press actually began to support King as a reformative, redemptive force
Right.
for civil rights, and the march in Washington, D.C. in August was about to take place, what role did King or Shuttlesworth or the SCLC or SNCC play in broadcasting the fact that there was going to be this big march in Washington, and many, many people from all over the nation, black and white, came to that? How did that occur?
Well, they just announced it. And there was a network, of course, of activists and organizations. Well, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Congress on Racial Equality, SCLC, SNCC, all of the different movements, NAACP, Roy Wilkins, the Urban League, they all got on board. And then they all were jockeying for how to control it. And Randolph, who had envisioned it, wanted one thing, but then he was so happy that it was finally taking place. He had been pushing for this since Roosevelt. And so here it was coming to the fore. And you may be aware that there's a back scene drama behind the scenes where there's a real radical speech prepared by the youth, John Lewis, as chairman of SNCC, the students. Now, John Lewis had been involved in the demonstrations from the beginning, an Alabamian, a native Alabamian, who had been in the sit-ins, gone to Nashville and been involved in protests there. He's on the original Freedom Ride. He's brutally beaten in Montgomery. He'll later lead the march in Selma and be beaten at Edmund Pettus Bridge. But John Lewis gives a speech at the March on Washington. And his speech is seen as too radical. And A. Philip Randolph and Roy Wilkins in particular is furious with it because he's always worked really within the system, insistent that Lewis change the language. And in the end, Lewis edits it down. He tones it down. He says instead of challenging Kennedy for failing to defend the civil liberties of activists in Alabama and Mississippi and Southwest Georgia, Lewis will say, we want our freedom and we want it now. And that's kind of how the speech plays out. But behind the scenes, as that's taking place, there's this lull, and they have to fill it. Why hasn't the march started? Why aren't the speakers speaking? And so they turn to Shuttlesworth, who's there, and they ask him to go out and say a few words, introducing him as the leader of that great success in Birmingham. But the reality is Shuttlesworth had been snubbed. He was not on the official program. He had not been invited to speak. And he was heard. And so they had him fill in as a kind of stopgap, which he'll do. Say a few words. Not nearly as eloquent as King, but it comes off well. I've got one more question if I can. Yes, sir?
Was Bull Connor ever punished for what he did? Because it seems like nowadays if someone pulled that on a protest movement, they would get canned.
Oh, sure, yeah. No, well, you couldn't do this today. Yeah. But that's a very good question, and the answer is no. But he was rewarded. There never has been a truth and reconciliation effort, and the closest anything has come to that would be reopening the cold cases, like the 16th Street Church bombing, which has happened, and it was a very cathartic experience. The first trial had been in the 70s, and they convict who everyone knew was the lead bomber, a guy named Dynamite Bob Chambliss. He'll die behind bars. But the whole case is reopened under the Clinton administration, and 2 more Klansmen are brought to justice. One's already died behind bars, the other will. And so, that's been as close to a truth and reconciliation effort that has taken place to bring to justice people like Bull Connor responsible for this kind of violation of civil liberties and human rights. But what happens to Connor is he leaves office. His appeal fails. The mayor-council system prevails in the Alabama courts. The Supreme Court uphold it. And the new mayor is Albert Boutwell. Connor will leave office, but then he'll get appointed to the Alabama Service Commission to oversee utilities. And he'll spend the rest of his life in that sinecure job for the state of Alabama. He'll have a stroke and spend it in a wheelchair, but he'll be rewarded for having fought the fight.
Then a round of applause for Professor Eskew.
Thank you very much. And come visit Birmingham.